Hello and welcome to our 10th botany lesson. Today is our 9th video lesson. So just a quick reminder to have your pencils and your lesson book ready and we will begin. Let's take a moment to focus our minds and do our opening verse. Tall as a tree I stand, for reach my roots in the earth, and warmth fills my heart with love. Looking quickly at where we're at, this is our 10th lesson. We're going to talk about birch and oak today. We will also be talking about our reading about Rachel Carson today. We have 2 classes left after this. We're going to talk briefly about cactuses, and we are going to talk about palm. Then in our last class, we'll talk about lily and rose. So we'll go right back to the beginning with the parts of the flowering plants. So just a little bit of an introduction to trees before we get started. So as we have been thinking of things in terms of plants being like children or comparing things to the winter, the earth in winter, and the earth in summer. If you remember way back at the beginning, we're kind of coming back to that idea of winter and summer with our introduction here to trees. So I'm going to read this for you momentarily. It says, "In winter, trees are as bare as the earth under them, the wood, the trunk, the branches. In winter, it is just like the earth itself. When spring comes, there are green shoots coming from the earth and green shoots coming from the wood. The wood has become like the earth again. The wood behaves like the earth." So this is kind of an interesting comparison. We're comparing our tree to the earth and the wood from the tree, how it is similar to earth and how it behaves similar to the earth. So in the spring, right? The little plants come out of the ground and the shoots come out of the wood for the tree. In winter, everything is bare, ground is bare, and the limbs for our trees are bare. And another interesting thing in the same comparison is eventually when that wood rots away, it turns into the earth itself. Um, so that just kind of is an interesting comparison, a way to look at what our trees are like and how they behave. Now we're going to talk about 2 different types of trees today. We're going to talk about birch and we are going to talk about oak. So go ahead and write down your tree introduction. Then we will talk about our birch and our oak, and we will look at some examples of those. So go ahead and go on when you're ready. Now, you see these pictures of the birch and the oak here, and they're very different types of trees. So we can say the mighty oak tree with its power and strength, it's thought of as the king of the wood. And you can see this what's called a live oak down here in the left-hand corner of this slide. It's this big, thick trunk and big, thick, strong, powerful limbs, a very kingly type tree. Moving on, it says, "While the elegant and graceful birch, with her long, slender trunk and branches, is known as the queen of the wood." So you can see her here on the right-hand side, these very long trunks, very slender branches, um, very regal in her own way, and beautiful, nice white bark. So some birches have this beautiful white bark that's sometimes used in decorations. Sometimes you see it used in interior decorations. The live oak, there's actually several different types of oak trees. The one that you see here is called a live oak. It commonly grows we see them a lot in the United States, in the southern states, Louisiana, Florida, Mississippi, those more southerly states. And this is probably one of my favorite trees. It has this big, huge trunk. The limbs, they come up and then they go back down to the ground and then they come up again. And they're just these wonderfully massive trees. But they are not the only type of oak. So we have lots of different types of oak trees out there. This is just one. And um, our oaks all look a little bit different, but they are all within a genus called the Quercus genus. And there's a lot you can do with oaks. So they're very strong trees. You can make them into wood. It makes a very strong lumber. There's other things you can do with the leaves, with the bark, and with the acorns. So we have the mighty king and the queen of the forest here, of the woods. So let's go ahead, take that down in your notebook, and then I want to look at some parts of these two trees. So you see here, you see on the left-hand side, we have the oak. Okay, so the oak leaf. And what I want you to notice about both of these, if you look at the veins in that leaf, right? They don't all go the same direction. They're a little bit varied in the way the veining is. And we're going to talk more about leaves in our last class. So kind of keep that in mind um, as we go on, because we'll talk about what that is and why it is in our last class. But for now, I just want you to notice it. Just look at the veining. It's very different from our birch tree over here on the other side. So oak leaves are very different, are somewhat different among the different species. This is just one example of an oak leaf. A black oak or a pin oak is usually what this leaf is most similar to within that Quercus genus. Um, the other thing that I want you to notice on both of these, this is something new that we haven't talked about. If we're looking at the picture of the oak leaf, in the upper right-hand corner, you see this yellow thing. What in the world is that yellow thing? This is called a catkin, okay? This is essentially a flower. And so in this case, we're actually back to those flowering plants at this point. And really the only divergence we're going to take from that is when we talk about cactus. But you can see these catkins here, and they look like, if you ever look at them in a tree, they look like little, looks like kind of yellow hair. And this is essentially the flowering part of the oak tree. Okay, so often when we have flowers, we have fruit. So you can look at that acorn there as the fruit of the tree. The seed is held within that acorn of the oak, right? Now, we can do lots of things with acorns. You have to process them a little bit because they do have what are called tannins in them, which are very, very astringent. They make the tissues of your body contract. If you've ever tried to pick up an acorn off the ground and eat it, you probably did not have a very good time. It was probably not very pleasant because of the tannins in that acorn. But you can boil your acorns and boil out the tannins. You can make them into pies, like a pecan pie, or you could actually grind them and you can make them into flour. There's something called acorn flour and make bread with that. So there's a lot of things you can do with our oak tree. Now, looking over here at the birch next, the catkin for the birch on the far right hand side, it's a little bit more organized. It's not quite as wild and crazy and hair-like as the oak. Those little flowers are a little smoother. They hang down a little bit straighter. So they're a little bit different. The other thing you'll notice is that birch leaf. Now, if you look at the veins on that birch leaf, they all pretty much go. There's a center vein, and then on either side of that vein is another vein um, running from one side to the other. You could draw your finger across one side of that V, and it would be straight across, or it would be V'd across, I guess. So that's another different type of leaf that we will talk about in our last class. So just take notice of it now. Take notice of the difference between that one and the oak leaf, which has a little bit more complex veining pattern. And we'll talk about the reasons for those and what those are coming up. So take a moment and draw those birch and oak leaves. Pay attention to those veins, those little veins, when you are drawing that, because we will come back to that. So when you are finished with that, we can go ahead and go on. So hopefully by now you've had a chance to read the story about Rachel Carson. This is the last story in our book. So you've come to the end of the stories that we are going to read in our book. There's still stories in that book. If you want to go ahead and read those too, you certainly can. But for our purposes, we're stopping our last entry in our book today with Rachel Carson. So she lived from 1907 to 1964. To start off with a little bit of information about her. Interestingly enough, as a lot of these people are connected in some ways, Rachel's mother used Anna Botsford Comstock's book that we talked about a few lessons back to teach her about nature. So that book, as I've said, that's a really important book, and it's still being used today. And it was even used, by very famous naturalists to start out their education about nature. So that's an interesting connection there to some of the people that we have read. Now, another interesting thing about her, reading and writing were actually her favorite subjects as a child, until a science professor convinced her that she should change majors. So she changed majors and she started studying science. Primarily, what she studied and she wrote about were microscopic sea plants and animals. That was her passion, her love that she liked to do. She also wrote a very important book called Silent Spring. Okay, a friend had written a letter to her about the effects of pesticides on the insects, and if we don't have the insects, then we don't hear those wonderful insect sounds. It also affects the birds. So when the insects are poisoned, sometimes the birds are poisoned as well. And she really brought this issue to light very early on for us. And it's still something that we're talking about, we're dealing with, we're struggling with today. So, an interesting book with an interesting topic and inspiration for her friend's letter. So go ahead and take down these few notes about her, and then I will talk about your questions about her. So when you are finished, you can go ahead and go on. All right, here are our 4 questions about Rachel Carson. Number 1, why did Rachel hate the school playground? So there was a very specific reason for that. We talked a little bit about this next one. What were Rachel's favorite subjects when she was younger? Number 3, in 1957, Rachel received a letter from a friend. What did it say? And number 4, what was Rachel's book, Silent Spring, about? So as you have done previously, go ahead, send those to me in a private message. And before we end today, I want to look ahead to what is next on our agenda. Next week is our last week, so we have some things to do before we end. So let's look at that. All right, so Rachel Carson questions due by class 12. Your last plant study, your fifth plant study, is due in class 11. So your final plant study slash plant report is going to be due in class 12. So that's similar to your plant study, but there's a little bit more to it. And a lot, and I know some people have been doing things in class close to this already, so that's great. Um, but we do have that one due in our last class. I also have given you, back at the beginning of class, several hands-on projects, and I explained them in your first video lesson. So if you don't remember what those were, you might want to go back, check on them, since that is also due in class 12. So that is our class for today. Let's go ahead and do our closing verse, and we will end for the day. So, now that all my work has ended, what I've learned I'll put to rest, always knowing, always seeing that I have done my best. Wisdom and power and love will grow, and I will bless all people that I know. All right, thanks, guys. Let me know if you have any questions. Bye bye.